Final Fantasy 1 and 2 saw many of their re-releases, remakes, and remasters released around the same time as each other, or simply released together in the same package. As such, if you've seen my Final Fantasy 1 video, there is going to be plenty of general info that crosses over between the two. But there's a very good reason I didn't put these two games together in the same video, and it's because of the quirks of Final Fantasy 2's designs, which introduces its own slew of differences and tweaks. Not only is Final Fantasy II a more narratively driven game, but it lacks a conventional leveling system, and this quirky leveling system is retained between every version. Another reason for the separate video is that Final Fantasy II never released on the NES. The Final Fantasy II we got on Super Nintendo was actually Final Fantasy IV. However, there is a fan translation of the second Famicom revision of the game, which it was a compilation cart of Final Fantasy 1 and 2. Between the two revisions in Japan, the original release and this compilation release, the only real difference is a typo fixed in the opening. Meanwhile, once again, the eShop versions of Final Fantasy 2 dulled the colors a bit to dim any bright flashing. So the first re-release of Final Fantasy II was on the Wonderswan Color. While there was already more cutscenes and dialogue in the original Famicom release compared to the first game, the Wonderswan version introduced further narrative with more cutscenes, dialogue, a prologue, and an epilogue, as well as a memorization minigame that was added while you're on the snowcraft. Now before we go any further, we have to explain how leveling and progression work in Final Fantasy II. There is no conventional leveling in this game. Instead, your stats and your skills with each weapon and spell all level individually. The max level for weapons and spells are 16, while stats go up to 99. You level up each stat or skill by utilizing them. So for example, to level up axes, you have to use axes a lot. To be better at casting Asuna and give it more benefits, you have to cast Asuna a lot. To raise your HP, you have to be hit. Also, for skills and evasion stats, the rank of the enemies you fight is part of what determines how much experience you'll get as well. With that all said, let's look at the gameplay changes. So for the Wonderswan Color version, one important tweak made that is carried over into every other version was that every time you gain weapon skill points, there's a bonus of 10 points applied. Additionally, the NES version always had an extra -1 tacked onto the formula, but that -1 has been removed. Now what all that means is that previously, in a fight where you'd gain 2 sword skill points for 2 hits of the sword, that same fight would now give you 13. So this means that weapon skills progress significantly faster now. Stats are also now totally capped at 99, including gear. In the Famicom version, gear could be used to raise the stats past the cap up to 109. Outside of skills and stats, though, characters now automatically retarget when a target dies, you can sprint in towns and dungeons, and you can view a world map. The UI and menus have been totally revamped, and with this revamp comes a myriad of quality of life upgrades, like comparing equipment when buying them, significantly more inventory space, keywords are now highlighted, and damage numbers are visible in battle. You have 2 options for automatically optimizing your equipment per character. You can optimize everything or simply only optimize your armor. Since optimizing everything will remove your equipped weapon for statistically better ones. But maybe you don't want that because you're leveling a certain weapon on that character. There's also now a temporary memo save, which goes away once the console is reset. Now otherwise, the Wonderswan Color version fixed a majority of bugs present in the original game. Some examples include stat overflow bugs, the healer staff still healing undead enemies on top of doing damage to them, healing to reset steps before an encounter, and spells like Dispel or Protect that were totally broken and didn't actually work. The 2 noteworthy bugs still found in this version of Final Fantasy II and subsequent versions until we address them is the action cancel bug and the Peninsula of Power. The visuals were upgraded to be more consistent with the other 2D Final Fantasy games at this time. There's also been additional sprite animation as well as new spell animations, and fights now happen on fully detailed backgrounds. The audio quality has also been upgraded. And not only that, but the save and rest themes from the first game were implemented, and 2 new boss themes were added as well. Now next up is the PlayStation version, which builds off of the Wonderswan Color remake. This version is part of a compilation known as Final Fantasy Origins. Final Fantasy 1 and 2 both released individually in Japan prior to this collection, but this collection served as the first time that anyone overseas actually got Final Fantasy 2. This is the version you'll find on the PS3 and Vita PSN US and Japanese stores. We'll see some characters had name changes that were different from what was expected, though the names will continue to be changed in later versions anyway. So this version now sports an FMV opening, a bestiary, art gallery, and item collection tracking. Now, while load times can't compare to the MSX2 version of Final Fantasy 1, load times are worse on this version of Final Fantasy 2 than any other version. Just like the Wonderswan Color version, there are toggles for auto-targeting, the presentation of the map, and dashing. However, when you beat the Origins version of Final Fantasy 2, you unlock normal mode. Yeah, the default difficulty you have to play first is easy, but nothing is changed at all between the 2 difficulties other than the option for auto-targeting, the minimap, and sprinting are disabled. Literally nothing else changes. The PS1 version's stats and skill mechanics are identical to the Wonderswan Color versions. However, one change that was made for balancing was that weapons no longer penalize your magic accuracy. Visually, this version utilized the sprite work of the Wonderswan Color version and adapted it for larger TV screens. This means that sprites are smaller, more text fits within the boxes, and colors are toned down since there is no need to compensate for no backlight. The music has also been redone again, this time using the PlayStation hardware. So it has to be emphasized, not only is the original game subject to the most bugs, but the leveling system requires a lot of patience and time investment. The changes to skills and stats beyond the Wonderswan Color and PS1 versions will make it evident that the NES version might have been a bit too much. So for the original NES experience, you may still want to consider a ROM hack that patches the game, but if you like the sound of the grind, then it's up to you. Otherwise, the Wonderswan Color and PS1 versions are just the beginning of adjustments being made to the game's mechanics that ultimately alter the difficulty and time investment for each version. And so the next version we'll look at is the Game Boy Advance version, and this compilation is known as Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls. Final Fantasy 2 here is based on the PSX version, though we'll see that this version makes the most significant rebalance tweaks of any version. Once again, there is no art gallery or item collection tracking, but the bestiary does remain, and you can unlock a music player by beating both games. The localization was polished even further from the PS1 version, and then the European version features multiple language options and sometimes uses a thinner font to accommodate languages with longer text strings. A post-game story was implemented known as the Soul of Rebirth, featuring other characters on a short adventure. This chase scene in the opening was also removed. Gameplay-wise, items can now be stacked, bought in bulk, and used in battle without needing to be equipped to each character prior. Prices have been reduced significantly across the board. Chests later in the game were upgraded from being potions to elixirs. Everyone starts with 10 MP instead of 5. Holding L and R will immediately set the party to flee. The Snowcraft memorization minigame's prizes were changed, and auto-targeting is made permanent. The first room in the game was also turned into a handy tutorial room when you walk back in as well, and some of the rotating fourth party members throughout the game also had their HP, MP, and skills buffed. Gear bonus stats, like the stats that are outside of defense, also now stack, where before the higher stat bonus was the only one that would apply. Additionally, you can save anywhere you want to now, including in dungeons. Prior to this version, skill growth was entirely flat. every level for weapons and magic took the same number of points to gain. Now, skill growth has a curve to it, where each sequential level requires more points, making leveling in the early game much faster paced and smoother. In terms of magic, the base damage of spells was raised, your intelligence and spirit stats aren't as impactful in the calculation anymore, and the teleport spell in particular, which is an instant death spell, had its base 0% accuracy increased to 50% accuracy, which makes it just as good as you think it would be. Additionally, HP now increases every 10 battles a character lives through, which was probably done to discourage hitting yourself to gain HP by giving you plenty of health from simple progression. Stats no longer decrease depending on the other stats that you are increasing anymore either, and to compensate, bosses received more HP to try and balance out all of these changes. One exploit prior to this version was known as the action cancel bug. You'd simply select and queue up the action you want to increase the level of, and then simply cancel the move. You could repeat this to safely level up any character's weapon or magic stats. However, this has finally been fixed in Dawn of Souls. Now, while lower resolution than the PlayStation version, the GBA version still uses the same set of sprites and still makes some advances over the Wonderswan Color's visuals, including the addition of character portraits during conversations. Music-wise, the soundtrack has also been redone once again for the GBA hardware. With these changes in Dawn of Souls, if you were looking for something more faithful to the original game's gameplay, but utilizing these visuals, you'd be looking at the PSX or Wonderswan Color version. But if you're down for a significantly faster paced progression system with a smidge of bonus content, then the GBA version serves that goal well. Next up is the mobile version that was done in collaboration with Bandai Namco. This version is based on the GBA version, including all of its mechanical changes and tweaks. However, this version doesn't have any extra cutscenes or dialogue featured in any version outside of the original. But yeah, you still automatically retarget, buy items in bulk, prices are reduced like they were in the GBA version, you still start with 10 MP, and the game's script, sprites, and balance are all the same as the GBA version. However, other additions like character portraits, item tracking, art gallery, and bestiary are not here. Moreover, your experience with this version depends on the device you use. Some versions use much tinier sprites to fit on tinier phones, featuring more issues such as no looping music, while the larger version features larger sprites and even incorporates touchscreen controls and overhauled UI to be made for said touch controls. The music quality had to suffer some compromises regardless of the version though. Some music is also cut like boss music, and some versions can't even play music at the same time as sound effects. Now up next we have the PlayStation Portable version. The soundtrack, FMV opening plus the Wonderswan Color opening, item collection tracking, and art gallery return from the PSX version. Otherwise, this version is based on the Dawn of Souls release. And this version can be found on the EU and Japanese PSN stores, but not the US PSN store. A language selection screen is present, cutscenes can be skipped, and there's a small handful of script tweaks. Additionally, a series of 3 bonus dungeons known as the Arcane Labyrinth were incorporated into this version. In terms of balance compared to the GBA version, the encounter rates of a few locations were slightly lowered. Also, the points required to level up your skills were subtly lowered as well, increasing the speed of progression ever so slightly. Additionally, the defend command was added. Meanwhile, the visuals have been overhauled dramatically from the Wonderswan Color sprites used up until now, which helps this version of Final Fantasy II align visually with the other PSP version of Final Fantasy I. And all the same, 3D is used subtly in the overworld, visual effects were revamped again, sky effects are present in towns and dungeons, and they've utilized effects like vignettes and gradient overlays. And next up, we now have the first smartphone release of Final Fantasy II, which builds further off of the PSP version and features all of its content as well, except for the FMV opening, art gallery, and window color options. However, this version has since been delisted with the release of the Pixel Remasters. Now, this version of Final Fantasy II doesn't seem to suffer the same speed-up issues as this version of Final Fantasy I has, though compatibility is still a crapshoot on modern smartphones, so as always, your mileage may vary. On top of the continued support of saving anywhere, an auto quick save system was used for whenever the game is closed or suspended. While using the PSP version as a base, both mechanically and in terms of visuals, the UI and menus were drastically overhauled and adapted to fit touchscreen controls since there is no controller support for this version, much like the Final Fantasy I port. The GBA version, and still the PSP version, offers significantly faster progression than any version so far, and the PSP version offers more bonus content as well as a different visual style. So far, we could say that these versions are the most accessible and less time-consuming versions, on top of having the most content of any version of the game so far. And now lastly, we arrive at the Pixel Remaster of Final Fantasy II. Now in comparison to the first game's Pixel Remaster, this one for Final Fantasy II takes more liberties in adopting visuals and gameplay from other versions outside of the original Famicom version. So, to begin, there is no Snowcraft minigame, Souls of Rebirth post-game story, or Arcane Labyrinth bonus dungeons. However, there is a bestiary, music player, item collection tracking, and an art gallery, as well as the PSP version's localization, along with even further fine-tuning to the script. A bulk of quality of life changes are retained, like auto-retargeting, the minimap, and sprinting. Not to mention, you've also now got local maps that show exactly where chests are, which can really help out in navigating dungeons. Previously, in the other versions of Final Fantasy II, characters in the back row couldn't hit or be hit by melee attacks. But in the Pixel Remaster, it's now similar to the other Final Fantasy games, where they can hit or be hit now, but there's a damage penalty to melee attacks. You can also change which row a character is in now during your turn. Also, when you have a secondary weapon equipped, it can hit a separate target if the first weapon kills the first target, and the results screen in battle now shows far more detail than ever before. You can't save in dungeons anymore though, but you do still have your quick save that now persists when the game is closed, so you can use that. For the first time, the game has an auto battle system that speeds up battles, repeating the last action you used, with the option to be on by default when a battle starts. Message speed is also now always instant, and you can't set sprinting to be on by default anymore. You also can't skip cutscenes anymore, and having everybody flee with L&R doesn't work anymore either. Much of the gameplay has seen even further rebalancing. Just like in the first game's Pixel Remaster, enemies now randomly go through their attacks instead of being on a cycle, and enemies such as Malboros, Devil's Blooms, and Antlions are now guaranteed to inflict ailments on physical attacks. Asuna also does not cure poison at level 1 anymore either. The game has seen a number of rebalancing tweaks. The number of skill points required for each level is in line with the GBA version and not the PSP version. Stat-wise, your max MP does raise faster now. Additionally, many more fights throughout the early and mid-game allow you to flee where you couldn't before. Enemies have higher resistance to teleport now, and encounter rates between zones have actually been nearly equalized across the board. So areas that didn't have as many encounters before will now have just as many encounters as anywhere else. A peninsula of power remained present in Final Fantasy II along the shore of Altair, which is the first town in the game, where encounters could be those from Mysidia, a location you won't visit until much later. This peninsula of power has once again been removed in the Pixel Remaster. Something else really peculiar that's missing from this Pixel Remaster is the option to only optimize your armor separate from your weapons. So in this version, if you have a spare weapon, it will replace a weapon on a character if it's statistically better than it. So after any optimizing, you may have to change the weapon back to what you wanted to keep it as. Or otherwise, just don't use the optimize button. The designs have once again been redone by Kazuko Shibuya, though this time the main party designs are a bit closer to the PSP version's designs, which, along with the previous port's designs, were based on concept art. This might have been done because some of the Famicom version designs were shared with the first game and had more limitations. Additionally, it's easier to notice in this Pixel Remaster that there are less frames of animation than any of the other versions. So what this means is, for example, there is no more looking left or right animations anymore. The Pixel Remaster also offers a classic filter, which simulates the effect of a CRT. It does its job in that when we study dense pixel areas, they do blend in and create the illusion of depth, though the filter may come off as too strong at first, especially on larger displays. The Pixel Remaster also supports a ton of aspect ratio and resolution options. The font also needs to be brought up again as well. Again, pass judgment based on the footage for yourself, but this font's so narrow and small that it's frustrating for some people to read constantly. For now, on PC you can either use a mod or swap the Japanese font's English characters in, but again, these solutions won't work for mobile users and it won't work for eventual console releases. Now, as of September 22nd, there have been 2 updates that addressed ongoing stability and VSync issues, fixed a handful of new bugs, and an attempt was made to make the text more readable. As you can see in this footage though, their solution has been to reduce the drop shadow. However, the last patch notes do say that more patches are coming. Meanwhile, the music has been entirely rescored with supervision from Uematsu himself, like the rest of the Pixel remasters. Additionally, some sound effects were lifted from Final Fantasy IV's 3D remake, as well as Final Fantasy V and VI's mobile ports. For those playing on mobile, there still is no controller support. However, an additional movement option was added where you can simply tap the tile you want to move to and you'll automatically move to it. While the UI for both versions of the Pixel Remaster is larger in a more touch-friendly design, the mobile version's UI is actually different from the PC versions. As such, the PC version is designed more traditionally with controllers in mind. Additionally, the bestiary has this interactive map view, and the mobile version's bestiary supports augmented reality battles, though just a heads up, there isn't actually any tracking to it. Reception to the Pixel remasters is critical since there are 7 other versions of this game you could possibly play, with varying levels of accessibility and different flavors of visuals and gameplay. If you want to download a version on Steam and play, then bam, you're done. Otherwise, there's things to consider like the visuals or gameplay experience that interest you. For example, the Famicom and Wonderswan Color and PS1 versions offer an experience more in line with the original game, while the GBA, PSP, and Pixel remasters ultimately feature significantly faster paced progression, for a game where its skill and stats systems is what turns most people away from it in the first place. The GBA and PSP versions also benefit from their bonus content, of course, as well. Though, like others have said on my previous video that I'd probably like to mention myself, the bonus content is just that, it is a bonus. Though at the end of the day, whether you're yearning for a grind or rather something that keeps up as you play, there is no wrong version of Final Fantasy II, so long as you enjoy the experience. So that does it for this video, so thanks for watching, and thank you to the Final Fantasy Wiki and speedrunning communities for their discussion and documentation of info featured in this video, as well as to Trenton for providing feedback and double checking info for me. Next up on the list is Final Fantasy 3, but in the meantime you can find me on Patreon if you'd like to support the videos, or find me on Twitter for updates.